Hello and welcome back, history scholars. This is going to be a little different than the videos that we've mainly been using for this online class, because this one's going to be quite a bit shorter. And as you can see, I don't really have a PowerPoint that I'm following here. This in our regular in-person class would be more of a discussion over a book that we're reading, this one here, The Founding Fathers and the Debate Over Religion in Revolutionary America. I hope you've enjoyed reading this. And I will have some discussion board assignments for you to do based on this book. But since we don't have the class time to have the discussion, I think it's probably best to use even a short recording here to at least give you uh, some pointers, some highlights here as you look through this book. So let's thumb through it, shall we? There's a lot in here, and I hope some of these things will stick in your mind long after this course is over, and it'll leave deep impressions on you because I think it's an important little book of documents. Most of this is primary source documents. We just have some of the commentary here by our editors, Matthew Harris and Thomas Kidd. Uh, First couple of chapters here were really well beyond now. Those would have been things that we read the first for the first exam, but still, I'll just point out here the chapter on the Continental Congress. Hopefully, you noted how much religion played an important part there among the founders that were meeting in the Continental Congress as the Revolutionary War was taking place. I'm not going over any particular documents here, but certainly the Declaration of Independence does emphasize how God is the giver of rights, and that it's because of God that we have that all men are created equal and have these inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They attribute that to a divine power. Um, and we also see in the Northwest Ordinance one of the most significant things that come out of the Confederation Congress. We see that the Northwest Ordinance provided for some land, some portion of land as the Northwest Ordinance is dealing with states around the Great Lakes, and as they are surveying that land and dividing it up, making townships there, they decide one portion, one square of that land ought to be preserved, especially for raising money for religious establishment. Even though they don't specify what Christian religion, exactly what denomination is going to be there, the founders all grow up in this world where every government has religion attached to it. There's just not really a government in existence at that time that tried to govern with no religious establishment whatsoever. So religion and government were certainly tied together. Um, Even if in America we had considerable religious freedom, they don't assume that you can govern with no religion whatsoever. So in the second chapter, religion and state governments were a little beyond that as well, but you can see that um, unlike the national constitution, a lot of state constitutions still had very religious provisions, for people to be able to serve in particular state roles. They had to, for example, believe in a Trinity. Well, you can't do that if you don't believe in the Christian Trinity. That would exclude Muslims or Jews or any other people. Now, a Catholic would still believe in Trinity, and so would Protestant Christians. So it doesn't necessarily give preference to one or the other there. But you notice those rules change from state to state. Some states do say you must come from a Protestant Christian background, or some more generically would just say that in order for a person to be the governor, for example, of a state, or to be one of the representatives from that state, they must believe in a future of rewards and punishments. So basically, they're saying you must believe in heaven and hell in order to serve in our government. Now, why would they do that? Um, well, they simply thought if someone believes that you are held accountable for what you do in this life, that's a more trustworthy person. That's a person who would behave in a way that uh, they know they're going to be held accountable for what they do. They'll be more honest, more upright. That's the assumption, at least. So we see in the state governments, original state governments, um, in the Revolutionary period, most of these states have some type of preference given to particular churches. Generally, Christian churches, Protestant Christian churches definitely have the advantage. Now, we've spoken about this already, and you've read about this too, but Virginia was quite an exception because in Virginia, um, they end up having no religious preference. That they accept Thomas Jefferson's idea that religion is purely private and it needs no government to support it. So, after a long history of Virginia having the Church of England as the official religion, and then the Episcopal Church, which would be the Americanized version of that, the state of Virginia accepted Jefferson's bill for religious freedom, which just chose no particular religion, not Christianity generally, not Protestantism generally, just no religion, no mention of it in their constitution. And that became the pattern for what would happen in the US Constitution, and a lot of other states are going to drift that direction as well. Here in the book, of course, we've got Jefferson's bill for religious freedom, page 71. But we also have the counter idea to that, and that was the bill for a general assessment of religion. Well, Patrick Henry's idea was we should have Christianity generally established, but you can decide which branch of Christianity to support. Do you want your tax money to go to the Episcopal Church that's been the official church? Then you can make sure your tithe is going to go to that church. If you're Presbyterian or if you're Baptist, you can make sure your money goes to these other groups that were never officially the state church of Virginia. But it will be your choice. But you've got to support something because religion was a part of established government. And Patrick Henry makes a good case for why that would be good, a general assessment of a general assessment tax for religion. The counter to that, you may remember reading this, assuming that you're reading this, the counter to Patrick Henry's idea was James Madison's Memorial and Remonstrance. It's really arguing that Thomas Jefferson's view would be better, the bill for religious freedom completely. Madison ultimately is saying it's dangerous to have government tied in with deciding what is legitimate religion and what is not legitimate. Because anyone could just make up a church and say their tax money is going to this new made up church. And the state of Virginia would have to decide what's a legitimate church and what's not. Madison doesn't want government in that position, neither does Thomas Jefferson. So that's how Virginia goes a very different way here. But overall, first couple of chapters, you get the idea religion was certainly tied in with government making from the very beginning of the Revolutionary period. Now, I'll get into some of the more specific individuals and documents here as we go on a little bit further. You see in the chapter on the Constitution that there's quite an impasse here. During the Constitutional Convention, they come to a point where they're having no agreement. They're not really moving forward. They're stuck between the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan. They can't really make any progress. And Benjamin Franklin actually suggests maybe we should pray about this. We've never really called on God's help in these whole proceedings. And that was really odd to have Benjamin Franklin in that position because he was one of the least traditionally Christian of anyone there. But even Franklin, being more deistical, more a man of the Enlightenment and not a believer in more traditional Christian teachings, he thought there is a higher power and we should call on God's help. Um, so, after that day, the Constitutional Convention did have regular prayers. And you see from these documents, there's quite a bit of disagreement about the religious clauses or what the Constitution has to say about religion. It doesn't really specify anything very Christian in the Constitution. There is no official religion established in America. They avoided that at the national level. The only real mentions of, or even hints of Christianity in the Constitution are, it says in the year of our Lord, that's just Anno Domini. That's just the way we say AD, 1787 AD, in the year of our Lord. Does that really mean you're a Christian, or is that just acknowledgement that this is the calendar that dominates the Western world? The only other mention is, or a slight hint of a mention, in the Constitution. It says, when it's describing how a president would veto a bill, it says if he doesn't sign a bill within 10 days, Sundays accepted, then the bill would be considered vetoed. Well, why do they exclude Sunday? It's just an assumption that in the Christian world, in a Christian society, presidents aren't going to be working on a Sunday. That's the Lord's day. Is that much of a mention of Christianity, or is that more just that's Western culture, that there's a weekend and Sunday is especially the day people are least likely to work? You could kind of see it either way, but there's no specific mention of Christianity or anything like that in the Constitution, the way that there was in the Declaration of Independence and Articles of Confederation or many state constitutions. The national constitution is different. But you also see in chapter 3, there's lots of other members who were at the Constitutional Convention that regret that there's not more mention of God in the Constitution. There's a section there by a delegate named Luther Martin, not Martin Luther from the Protestant Reformation that goes back a couple hundred more years, but from Luther Martin of Maryland. He thinks we should have had an acknowledgement that God is Lord. He's the one we ultimately want to please. We should have said something like that in our Constitution. So this is not a new argument. The place of religion in government, that's not something just 20th century, 21st century people have argued about. It was right there at the Constitutional Convention as well. Okay, I think I can, I've hinted at a few enough general principles there. We'll get into some specific things starting in chapter 4. Now, this is the part that deals with the Constitution actually being in action, the Federalist era, we may say. And I wanted to point out something here about George Washington's farewell address. You may recall George Washington is president for 2 terms. Neither side really wants him to stop being president, but he's eventually going to do that. Actually, before I get to farewell address, there's other things here. There's a section here on establishing chaplains, congressional chaplains, and also President Washington, before he was president, he used chaplains in the U.S. military. So what is the place of religion in American public life if the U.S. military and Congress has chaplains to lead prayers and encourage spiritual development. That's something Washington really believed in here. And in fact, the second document here has George Washington making a Thanksgiving proclamation. This is what's going to actually turn into a national holiday. It used to be more just a New England celebration of the Pilgrims first surviving their first, well, not surviving the winter, but having their first harvest. Becomes more of a national day of Thanksgiving here. And that was pretty common. Several times in the founding generation, Congress would encourage days of prayer and fasting and Thanksgiving, particularly in times of crisis that would come up. This is simply the first example. Washington, first example after the Constitution is in effect, that George Washington is making this a special day of Thanksgiving. Okay, and finally we get to his farewell address. There's lots in here about what he says in the farewell address about American foreign relations and not having preference for any particular allies. You know, we need to stay neutral. We need to avoid political parties. But notice also what he says here, page 121. Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. In vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism who should labor to subvert these great pillars of human happiness, these firmest props of the duties of men and citizens. I'll let you read the rest here, but notice President Washington is saying, in order for us to have a good republic here, our government relies on people being self-governing people. And if we're going to rule, if the people are actually going to rule in this republic, then they must be self-governing. And the main thing that's going to help us be good self-governing citizens are religion and morality. Those are going to be the pillars to make us a good law-abiding people, people that will be fair and just with one another when we establish this government. It's pretty remarkable that Washington seemed to think you can't have a good republic without religion and morality being supported and promoted, encouraged. Now he's different than Thomas Jefferson in that regard. Jefferson thought religion and morality, you know, sure, they're good, but you can be moral without being religious. Washington doesn't seem to think so. He thinks the Christian religion is really what's going to give us the kind of character that we need to have this republic actually work. So our first president felt pretty strongly about that. But he makes it clear he's not being exclusive. He's not saying Baptists and Presbyterians are all wrong and they're bad for America, because he happens to be an Episcopal, you know, one who had been an Anglican Christian before. He encourages all types, and in fact, he will write letters to several of these religious minority communities, letting them know they're still welcome in America. Washington respects these other religious views and people who hold those other views, as long as it contributes well to being a good citizen of the United States. Washington is fine with it. So there's a famous letter he writes to a Jewish community in Rhode Island. That's one of the documents in here as well, that he's going to say they have nothing to fear in the United States. They're not going to suffer discrimination in any way. Now, where Washington would be most upset at religious views are those who might say they are pacifists. So they may want the benefits of a government and peace that it can bring, but they won't contribute to any fight or any war. Washington didn't have as much tolerance for views like that, Quaker views, or any that are going to be pacifists. Washington thought religion and good citizenship go hand in hand. Okay, so another document, I pointed out his farewell address. Treaty with Tripoli. This is kind of interesting too. Now, our editors have selected certain documents that will get the most attention here, of many that they could have chosen. But this one's really interesting because this is an example of, this comes from the United States having trouble with their ships being harassed off the coast of northern Africa. Tripoli is in North Africa, and it's part of what was then known as the Barbary Pirates. American ships are being harassed there much more than they would have been when they were under a British flag. And so an American ambassador named Joel Barlow was trying to settle things, conflict with the country of Tripoli. And he says on page 123, as the government of the United States of America is not in any sense formed on the Christian religion, as it has in itself no character of enmity against the laws, religion, or tranquility of Muslimin. That was his old way of saying Muslims. He says the United States is in no way a Christian nation. Now, some people take this one document in isolation and say, right here, we have it, 1797, a diplomat, official treaty with another country. We're saying we're not a Christian nation in any sense, in any way. Well, you have to be careful just picking one document, and coming to great big conclusions after that, because this whole chapter is filled with Thanksgiving proclamations, days of prayer and fasting and Thanksgiving. In fact, I think it's at the end of this chapter or near the end, we get President Thomas Jefferson talking about how we're going to set some money aside to actually send missionaries in among Native Americans. He's fine with supporting religion, even the Catholic Church, where Catholics have made some progress in teaching Indians their religion. Jefferson thought, well, that's good. The sooner Native Americans are Christianized, doesn't really matter which branch of Christianity, but the sooner they are taught Christianity, the more assimilated they become in American society, the less hostility there would be. So you have to kind of look at these things together. One document may say, we are in no way a Christian religion in dealing with Tripoli, because that's a Muslim nation, and we don't want there to be automatic war, holy war or crusade between a Christian country and an Islamic country. But then just a few years later, Thomas Jefferson is even saying, we will encourage Christianity, even Catholic Christianity, among Native Americans. It's very interesting. The question of how religious or what role religion played in government, it's a lot more murky than just black or white, yes or no. Notice here also between kind of in the mix of this same chapter here, John Adams proclaims a day of fasting and prayer, 1798. Well, if you're kind of thinking your timeline here, 1798, this is when Federalists are in control in the federal government, and there's an undeclared war with France going on. John Adams says we need to have prayer and fasting because we've got this national crisis. Here his proclamation. He says, as the safety and prosperity of nations ultimately and essentially depends on the protection and blessing of Almighty God, and the national acknowledgement of this truth is not only an indispensable duty which the people owe to him, but a duty whose natural influence is favorable to the promotion of that morality and piety. We've got this national emergency. We need to be calling on God's aid to see us through this crisis. Well, how people thought about that proclamation really had a lot more to do with what they thought of politics than what they thought of Christianity. A lot of Federalists would support this kind of proclamation. Yes, we need God on our side. We're in this conflict with atheist France, and we want God's favor on our side. But Thomas Jefferson and the Republican Party, they're not going to see it that way. They're going to say Federalists created this crisis with France, and now they're going to pretend that God's on their side. They're going to call for prayer and fasting. Why? They're trying to establish religion. They're trying to make sure that congregational Christianity from New England dominates everything. That could be a Jeffersonian reaction here. Just imagine, put it in more recent context. If we had some sort of crisis go on in more recent years, and let's say Donald Trump wanted to declare a national day of prayer and fasting, would his opponents think, what a holy and righteous person he is to declare and encourage prayer and fasting? No, I think his opponents would think he's insincere in this claim, and they would also say you're violating the Constitution, which separates church and state. But it would be almost opposite people that would say the same if, let's say President Obama or President Biden was making let's have a national prayer because of some issue that they're dealing with. Their opponents would be the first to say, this is insincere, this is pure politics, don't buy into it. Okay, so prayer, fasting, Thanksgiving days, those are often tied into partisan politics as well, and people would argue about that. Um, it hurts John Adams for a lot of people to make it seem like he's trying to establish his type of Christianity everywhere. But among certain other people, it would hurt Thomas Jefferson for those people to think Jefferson's not even a real Christian. He's more an atheist. He's an enemy of Christianity. Very extreme views on either side. Speaking of Jefferson, let's get to one of the most famous documents in here, and that is Jefferson's letter to the Danbury Baptist. It starts on page 149. This is the letter where we have their letter to him first, and then his reply to them. The Danbury Baptist Association was a group of Baptist churches in Connecticut, and they were supporters of Jefferson. You have to understand, the dominant church in any New England state at this time, other than Rhode Island, they're always the exception, but the dominant church in New England were the congregational churches. They were what the Puritans brought with them. Baptists were also congregational, but they differed in mainly their teaching on baptism. They only baptized people old enough to believe and choose to be baptized, where Congregationalists, they're baptizing infants as a passing on of the covenant within a family. So Baptists had never been the established church in New England. Baptists really resent having to pay their taxes that are going to go support congregational churches. They don't like that. And Baptist churches, frankly, had been growing a lot faster than the Congregationalists ever since the Great Awakening. So here's a group of Baptists in Connecticut who were saying, Mr. President Thomas Jefferson, we respect you. We know you're a champion of religious freedom. You believe in Virginia that no church should get any kind of preference, and we like that. It's not that Jefferson and Baptist had a lot of other things in common. theologically, what they would teach or practice. They don't, but they do share that in common. They both want just religious freedom. Baptists had never been an established church here. They never had tax support. So they just don't want anyone to have tax support. And they feel pretty comfortable that they can recruit and have new members as much as anyone. And they will be quite successful at that. So notice this Danbury Baptist group, they're not against religious days of Thanksgiving, prayer, anything like that. They're against having one denomination, the Congregationalist, having an advantage over all other Christian groups. So they write to Thomas Jefferson, and here's what he says in his reply. This is the where we get this famous phrase. He says on page 152, believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God, that he owes account to none other for his faith or his worship, that the legislative powers of government reach actions only and not opinions, I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people, which declared that their legislature should, and then he quotes, make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibit the free exercise thereof. That's a quote of the First Amendment. And then he's not quoting anymore. He says, thus building a wall of separation between church and state. Now, we've heard that phrase so much, that the wall of separation. Some people assume, well, it's in the Constitution. No, it's not. It's Jefferson's commentary. It's him writing to a group of supporters saying, I agree with you. Religion is just a personal thing, doesn't need to get government involved. Here, our First Amendment even says that Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion. It can't establish any religion, and it can't prohibit the free exercise of religion. And then Jefferson adds, and thus it has built a wall of separation between church and state. Well, we've heard that phrase a lot. In fact, Supreme Court has sometimes used that phrase as they make rulings that deal with religion in public. But you have to bear in mind, Jefferson was not exactly the expert on the Constitution or what the constitutional writers intended. He wasn't at the Constitutional Convention. Remember, he was in France as an ambassador for the United States. Now, it still can be an important point, but there's other metaphors people used. There's a document here where George Washington says, there are barriers, protective fences between government and church, but everyone may see this supposed wall differently. Is this a wall that means there can be nothing religious taking place in a public realm, or nothing religious that comes from government in any way? I don't think that's what Jefferson means exactly, because when he was governor of Virginia, they had special days of prayer and Thanksgiving through the Revolutionary War. I think, and this comes really from a much better expert on this than I am, there's a great book on this about Thomas Jefferson and this wall of separation between church and state, where the author says, look, Jefferson believed this First Amendment limited what Congress can do, what the national government can do. It doesn't really say what states can do. And Jefferson's a big believer in state governments making their own rules. So Jefferson is not saying, Danbury Baptist, we're going to get rid of the congregational establishment. We're going to end that because it's unjust. No, Jefferson is content to let states make their own ruling. He has been the author of the Bill for Religious Freedom in Virginia. He certainly hopes others will follow that lead, but he's not saying we're going to end the religious establishment in Connecticut and we are going to make sure that there's nothing religious taking place in government again. There still will be chaplains. There'll still be days of prayer and thanksgiving, and lots of religious like uh, rules and ceremonies centered around the government. This wall of separation is more between what the National Congress can do and establishing religion. Um, so important distinction there. And speaking of, I think in our study guide later, we'll see a couple of names that come up here. Um, um, which I'm going blank on right now. Um, names like John Leland, Isaac Backus. We have a couple of documents from each of those. These are also a couple of New England Baptists. So, Baptists in New England especially are going to resent this establishment that Congregationalists have. And Isaac Backus will actually point out, look, when you tax us, when you take our tax money to support another church, it's like we're having taxation without representation. Makes a great appeal to that mantra during the Revolutionary War. Now, those men, Isaac Backus, John Leland, those Baptists from New England, they're not going to be as secular as Thomas Jefferson. They're not going to say, we need to get rid of religion in the public sphere. No, New Englanders are quite fond at this time of having having special days, Thanksgiving days. They don't see a problem with government doing religious things. They just don't want to give preference to any one particular group. So the latter part of this book deals more with just some individual founders. I won't go through each one of these, but I want you to just note the variety here. When people talk about what did the founding fathers believe, what's the prevailing view on religion? It really is a matter of which ones are you talking about? Thomas Jefferson definitely stands out as more liberal, more secular than most. Benjamin Franklin might be in that direction as well. But you could just as easily focus on some other individuals, Patrick Henry or Sam Adams. They tend to be among the more traditionally Christian, much more supportive of Christianity having a large role in the government. I mentioned Washington. He's kind of an enigmatic person religiously as well, because he certainly thought it was important to develop morality. He thought it's important for making good citizens. But Washington, he does some things that have people wondering just how Christian was he? He didn't attend church all the time. Not every week those doors are open. And even when he did attend, he doesn't always take communion. Now, does he not believe in death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus? That's a fundamental belief of Christianity. Well, you'll also see some scholars explain these things by pointing out in Virginia, there's no real city here. People are so spread out. It wasn't so easy to just get to a church service every week. So we can't read too much into Washington infrequently visiting church. And as far as the communion part, well, when he was not really taking part in communion, it was also a time when there's this tension with Great Britain. We're breaking away from Great Britain, and to go to an Anglican church and take communion, you were also declaring that you acknowledge the king as the head of the English church. Washington's not going to do that. So is he really rejecting communion because somehow he rejects the teaching of Jesus's sacrifice, his crucifixion? Not likely. Maybe more of a political statement about the king's power. And so you'll find a variety of religious views. One of the more interesting here to me is a very significant founder, maybe lesser known in our schools today, at least in our part of the country. Roger Sherman of Connecticut. Um, he's kind of their most important founder. He's everywhere in all those documents like the Declaration and the Constitution. Roger Sherman's always the man for Connecticut. But we find here he's a very, very religious man, very conversant on all theological issues, um, uh, feels very strongly in his views, and he's willing to challenge other people in their views. So that last chapter where we get a scattering of a few founders and their religious beliefs, hopefully you'll see the founding fathers did not have just one particular set of views. They range from some who are quite deistical, not very traditional Christians at all, that some who challenge a lot of the teachings of the New Testament, some who think Jesus is a good man, a good teacher, but not really divine, not really God's son. And then you got some that are very, very traditional Christians who would believe in Jesus as God's son and the only way um, to really know God. So there's quite a range in between. But the thing that really differentiates this generation from, say, some that would come later in the 20th, 21st century, there is no atheist founder. They all believe in a heaven and hell. They believe that there is a God that created this world, created people, and people will be answerable to that God. So I find this book very, very interesting. Hope that you're getting some things out of it too. But when you see on the study guide, there'll be a few documents or individuals that I'll say, pay attention to those. And this could also help as we're doing discussion boards on this topic as well. Hopefully this video will help you kind of navigate most important portions of this work. That's all for now. I will see you again soon, I'm sure. Goodbye.